American Politics Today, Chapter 9, Part 1, Interest Groups. Do interest groups serve the needs of the many or the privileged few? The provision isn't about coronavirus working families or small businesses struggling to stay afloat. It is just more insider politics to get millions to those who have millions, especially real estate investors and hedge fund managers. Representative Lloyd Doggett. The attempt to paint this tax provision as a boon for real estate and hedge fund investors completely misses the mark. This misleading talking point ignores the unimaginable economic losses that are painfully occurring across my state of Iowa, and the rest of America. Senator Chuck Grassley. When a staggering number of Americans lost their jobs in 2020 as the coronavirus pandemic crossed the United States, it was clear Congress needed to act in quick succession. It passed 4 relief bills that pumped trillions of dollars into the economy. The largest of these, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security CARES Act, provided $2.2 trillion for direct payments to individuals, forgivable loans to small businesses, and assistance to state and local government and hospitals. There were huge logistical problems with quickly distributing that much money, and there were some significant glitches. Millions of people didn't receive their $1,200 checks for several months, and more than 200 large businesses engaged in the time-honored tradition of feeding at the public trough by taking billions of dollars that were intended for small businesses. Chastened by the public scrutiny and a stern warning from Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin that large companies would face severe consequences if they took money they weren't entitled to, dozens of businesses returned the taxpayers' money, including Potbelly, Shake Shack, Ruth's Chris Steakhouse, and the Los Angeles Lakers basketball team. While these problems made headlines, a much more significant misuse of taxpayers' funds initially slid through with little attention: a set of changes to the 2017 tax cut, which had been a key legislative success of the Trump administration and a fulfillment of campaign promise to reduce the tax burden on businesses. These changes, when integrated into the coronavirus legislation, illustrate the power of interest groups in the political system. In the 2017 tax cut legislation, Congress placed income limits on some of the more generous tax cuts to reduce the loss of revenue, but in the CARES Act, it repealed those limits, which could result in a staggering loss of $135 billion in tax revenue over the next 10 years. The details get a little complicated, which is probably why this didn't get as much attention. After all, it is easier for people to understand why the LA Lakers, one of the most highly valued teams in the world at $3.7 billion, shouldn't get a $4.6 million loan that was intended for small businesses than it is to understand arcane details of tax policy. We don't need to get into the details here to understand the broad issues at play. These income limit rollbacks affect how business owners can use losses from their businesses to cancel out other non-business income. Another provision rolls back the restrictions on how much debt some companies can deduct from their taxes. How did this happen? Well, large corporations had lobbied hard to change these restrictions since they were enacted in 2017. And in an example that illustrates the power of these corporations' lobbying efforts, Congress snuck the provisions into the massive bill. Once these changes in the tax law came to light shortly after the CARES bill was signed, an analysis by the nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation revealed that 80% of the tax cuts included in the bill went to business owners making more than $1 million, because only couples with $500,000 of non-business income benefited from the policy change, and 43,000 business owners received a tax cut on an average of $1.6 million each, which means they received more total dollars than 47 million people earning less than $20,000, who got $1,200 each. The $135 billion tax for the tax credit is 3 times more than the CARES Act is spending on safety net programs like food and housing aid, $42 billion, and is more than is being spent on hospitals and other public health services, $100 billion. Perhaps the most outrageous part of the policy is that wealthy business owners can exploit losses unrelated to the pandemic because the law allows them to retroactively write off losses from 2018 and 2019, well before we even knew about the virus. The chapter surveys the wide range of interest groups in American politics, from large, powerful groups such as the National Rifle Association, the NRA, to small organizations that lobby on issues that concern only a few Americans. Our aim is to get to the bottom of examples in which the lobbyists lose and understand examples in which it seems like the lobbyists always win. As with the CARES Act tax cuts, some people such as Senator Chuck Grassley argue that such policies are good for the overall economy and are in the public's interest. However, many others always root for lobbyists with their perceived insider connections and undue influence to lose their battles. Is it fair to characterize all interest groups as well-interested organizations that undermine the public good? Are interest groups really too powerful manipulators of the American policy process? What are interest groups? Interest groups are organizations that seek to influence government policy. Interest groups may represent very specific or more general interests, and they use a variety of tactics such as lobbying, elected officials, and bureaucrats helping draft legislation, mobilizing members and the public to apply pressure on and work with legislators and government agencies, and helping to elect candidates who support the organization's policy goals. Excuse me. Lobbying involves persuasion and monitoring policy development by using reports, protests, informal meetings, or other techniques to convince an elected official or bureaucrat to help enact a law, craft a regulation, or do something else that a group wants. In this way, interest groups serve as a linkage institution between the people and their elected representatives. The members of an interest group can be individual citizens, local governments, businesses, foundations, or nonprofit organizations, churches, or virtually any other entity. An interest group's employees or members may lobby on the group's behalf, or a group may hire a lobbyist or lobbying firm to do the work for it. Nuts and Bolts 9.1 gives Annex some examples of types of interest groups found in contemporary American politics. Single issue groups, ideological groups, and protest movements form with the goal of influencing society and policy making. One such group is Public Citizen, which conducts research projects, lobbies legislators and bureaucrats, and tries to rally public opinion on a range of environmental, health, and energy issues. In other cases, lobbying is only one part of what an organization does. The NRA, for example, endorses candidates, contributes to campaigns, and lobbies of elected officials, but it also runs gun safety classes, holds competitions, and sells gun accessories to its members. Interest group activity is almost hidden within their other organizations. For example, most drivers know that the AAA, formerly the American Automobile Association, provides emergency roadside service and maps, but many people are not aware that the AAA is also an interest group of lobbyists for policies such as limiting new drivers to daylight out only hours. As these descriptions suggest, interest groups and lobbying are ubiquitous, I'm so sorry if I mispronounced that, in American politics. You may think that you don't belong to a group that lobbies the federal government, but the odds are that you do. Organizational structures. Interest groups differ in how they are organized, whether the group is one body or made up of many smaller local groups. How a group is organized makes the difference for the kinds of lobbying tactics it can use, as well as how decisions are made about what to lobby for. Centralized groups or confederations. There are two main models of interest group structure. Most large, well-known organizations like the AARP and the NRA are centralized groups, which means the organization's leadership is concentrated in its headquarters. These national organizations typically have headquarters in Washington, D.C., field offices in large state capitals, and members nationwide. Their leaders determine the group's lobbying goals and tactics. The other structural model is confederation, which comprises largely independent local organizations. For example, the National Independent Automobile Dealers Association, the NIADA, encompasses 50 state-level organizations that provide membership benefits to car dealers who join, and that also raise much of the money in the NIADA contributions to political candidates, several $1 million in recent elections. Both organizational structures have advantages and disadvantages. A centralized organization controls all groups' resources and can deploy them efficiently. But it can be challenging for these groups to find out what their members want. In contrast, because confederations maintain independent chapters at the state and local levels, their national headquarters can easily learn what the members want simply by contacting the local groups. But this strength is related to a weakness because state and local chapters mostly function independently of the national headquarters. Confederated groups often experience conflict as different local chapters disagree over what to lobby for and which candidates to support. Mass association or peak associations. Interest groups can be categorized in terms of the size of their membership and the members' role in the group's activities. Mass associations with many dues-paying members tend to be citizen groups and labor organizations. One example is the Sierra Club, which has over 3 million members. Besides keeping its members informed about the implementation of environmental policy in Washington, D.C., the Sierra Club endorses judicial nominees and candidates for elected positions, files lawsuits to increase environmental protection on government projects, and works with members of Congress to develop legislative proposals. The group's members elect the organization's board of directors. Yet not all mass associations give members a say in selecting their leaders or determining their mission. For example, the AARP claims to lobby for policies its members favor, but members actually have no control over which legislative causes the group chooses. Moreover, the AARP does not poll members to determine its issues, positions, nor do members elect AARP leadership. The members of peak associations are businesses or other organizations rather than individuals. Individuals cannot join peak associations. They may work for member companies or organizations, but they cannot become dues-paying members on their own. The Business Industry Political Action Committee, BIPAC, an association of several hundred businesses and trade associations that aims to elect pro-business individuals to Congress, is a good example of a peak association. Membership benefits and incentives. Attracting members is important for interest groups' success. Society is full of groups of like-minded people who do not organize to lobby or who choose to engage in free writing, and thus enjoy the benefits of organizations without participating. Therefore, most organizations develop mechanisms to promote participation. These selective incentives fall into 3 categories: benefits from participation, coercion, and material goods. Studies of political parties and interest groups find that some individuals volunteer out of a sense of duty because they enjoy working together toward a common goal. These benefits of participation are called either solidary benefits, which come from working with like-minded people, or purposive benefits, which come from workings to achieve a desired policy goal. If most people were spurred to political action because of participation benefits, the free rider problem wouldn't exist. A second mechanism is coercion or required participation, considered labor unions. They provide public goods to workers by negotiating with management on behalf of worker members over pay issues and work requirements. In many cases, worker members have to join the union. Union shop laws require them to pay union dues as a condition of their employment. Finally, material benefits, also called material incentives, are benefits given only to the members of a given interest group. Thus, for example, AAA members can call AAA at any time for emergency service when they have car trouble. AAA also provides its members with annotated maps and travel guides, discounts at hotels and restaurants, and other benefits. These services mask the interest group role of AAA. For example, its Foundation for Traffic Safety delivers research reports to legislators on topics ranging from lowering the blood alcohol level threshold that legally defines drunk driving to increasing the restrictions on driving by senior citizens. It's unlikely that many AAA members who join for the selective incentives are aware of the organization's lobbying efforts. The incentives drive membership, which funds the organization's lobbying operation. Resources and challenges. Interest groups using 3 key resources to support their lobbying efforts: people, the members, money, and expertise. The resources that a group has at its disposal significantly influence its available lobbying strategies. We will examine some of the strategies in more detail in a later section. Some large groups have sufficient funding and staff to pursue a wide range of strategies, whereas some smaller groups with fewer resources face more significant challenges when it comes to the lobbying options they have at their disposal. A crucial resource for most interest groups is their membership. Group members can write to or meet the elected officials, travel to Washington for demonstration, and can offer expertise or advice to the group's leaders. When the members of the group are corporations, as is the case with trade associations, CEOs and other corporate staff can help with the group's lobbying efforts. Money is another important resource. Virtually everything interest groups do can be purchased as services. Groups can spend money on hiring people to meet with elected officials and to fight for what they want in court. Money can also go toward campaign contributions or developing and running campaign ads. And of course, money is necessary to fund interest groups' everyday operations. Well-funded interest groups and firms have a considerable advantage in the lobbying process. If they need an expert or a lobbyist or a lawyer, they can hire one, or they can open a Washington office to increase contacts with legislators and bureaucrats. They can pay for campaign ads and make contributions to candidates and parties. While groups with less cash cannot use these strategies, smaller firms might join a trade association to lobby for policies that help all of the association's members. Expertise is a third type of group resource. It takes many forms. Groups can employ staff or hire experts to conduct research or develop policy proposals related to their interests. A firm's in-house lobbyist can provide information about how a change in government policy will affect the firm's profits and employment. Some lobbying firms, especially those that employ former members of Congress or congressional staff, may also have inside information on the kinds of policies that are likely to be enacted in the House or Senate. Interest groups with dues-paying members, such as the Sierra Club, can poll them to find out what they would like government to do. All of this information can be deployed to persuade elected officials or bureaucrats about the merits of a group's or firm's demands, as well as the political consequences of inaction, and offer ready-made policy solution to the problems the group has identified. Staff. Interest group staff fall into 2 categories: experts on the group's main policy areas and people with useful government connections and knowledge of procedures. The first group includes scientists, engineers, and others with advanced degrees. The second primarily comprises of people who have worked inside government as elected officials, bureaucrats, or legislative staff. Sometimes these former members of government are also policy experts, but their unique contribution is their knowledge of how the government works and their already existing relationships with office holders and other former co-workers in government. The practice of moving from a government position to a job within an interest group or lobbying firm, or the transitioning from a lobbyist to an office holder is often called revolving door. For example, as of 2020, more than half of the members of Congress who retired at the end of the 115th Congress and were employed had moved to lobbying jobs. The percentages are similar for congressional staff and bureaucrats. Many observers view this dynamic as potentially sowing seeds of corruption. They fear that past government employees might capitalize on personal ties with their former colleagues to negotiate favorable deals for their interest groups, or that people working in government may give special treatment to a corporation or interest group that might hire them as a lobbyist in the future. These concerns have led to a proposed restriction on the revolving door, including banning former elected officials, staff, and bureaucrats from working as lobbyists for some time period after they have left government service, as well as banning former lobbyists in government positions from administering programs that they previously lobbied for. The business of lobbying. Interest group lobbying is regulated. Lobbying firms must file quarterly reports identifying their clients, specifying how much each client paid, and the issues they lobbied on. Similarly, interest groups and corporations must file reports that list staff members who spent more than 20% of their time lobbying Congress and total expenditures to lobbying firms. Data from these sources and others offer insight into the extent of lobbying in American politics. Today, lobbying involves billions of dollars a year. Figure 9.1 presents annual lobbying expenditures for 2000 through 2019. As the figures show, a total of $3.51 billion was spent on lobbying in 2019. The amount spent, as well as the number of groups lobbying government, increased significantly from 2000 to 2010 and has held steady since then. Why are there so many interest groups and registered lobbyists, and why are their numbers increasing? Figure 9.1 bottom suggests that this proliferation is related to the large size and widespread influence of the federal government. Simply put, the federal government does so many things and spends so much money that many individuals, organizations, and corporations have strong incentives for lobbying. Corporations may lobby for a government contract or for regulation that favor their business sector. Corporations may also lobby to prevent new regulation or reverse existing rules that hurt their profits. In the first 2 months of the Trump administration, Congress reversed 14 regulations that were passed at the end of Obama's presidency, and 100 environmental rules were overturned by 2020. Energy companies lobbied hard on the Keystone XL pipeline, offshore drilling in the Atlantic and Arctic Oceans, and calculations of the social cost of carbon, and they won. The Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, also replaced the Obama-era emissions rules for power plants and vehicles, weakened protections for more than half of the nation's wetlands, and eased restrictions on mercury emissions from power plants. While businesses dominate lobbying spending, individuals may lobby the government to place limits on what citizens can do or to relax restrictions on behavior or to change corporate behavior. Trade unions and single-issue groups also spend millions of dollars on lobbying. Expenditures on lobbying pay for many things. The largest expense is for salaries. For example, in 2018, the top 20 defense contractors hired 645 former senior government officials and legislative staff, top military leaders, and members of Congress. 90% of these former officials became registered lobbyists. Top-level officials don't come cheap. Lobbyists also spend on publicity and outreach. Here is figure 9.1. For example, when Lockheed Corporation lobbied Congress on contracts for the new F-35 fighter attack plane for the military, Lockheed's lobbyists ran ads in newspapers in Washington, D.C., promoting its new warplane. Lobbying firms also spend money to generate grassroots support by getting people to contact their members of Congress, as we discuss later in the chapter. Figure 9.2 shows lobbying expenditures for several different firms and associations for 2 years, in 2018 to 2019. 3 associations and 1 policy center were the highest spenders on lobbying during this time. It's not hard to imagine why each group devotes so much effort to lobbying. Realtors, for example, might be concerned about maintaining government policies that make it almost essential to hire a realtor to help buy or sell a home, while the $121 million the National Association of Realtors spent on lobbying may sound like a lot. It really isn't that much. After all, over 1 million people work in the real estate, generating billions of dollars in profits every year. The surprise is that real estate brokers are willing to spend only a tiny fraction of their profits to keep their near monopoly in place. The same is true for the large firms listed in figure 9.2. Apple, for example, is one of the largest firms in the United States, but it spends only about $7 million per year on lobbying, $14.1 million over 2 years, and only one of the influential interest groups in figure 9.2, the AARP, spends more than $10 million per year on lobbying. Clearly, the big spenders on lobbying are exceptions to the rule, and most interest groups and firms spend relatively little on lobbying. For example, the group that sends a turkey to the White House for ceremonial pardon every year at Thanksgiving, the National Turkey Foundation spends $140,000 a year to lobby the federal government on relatively small range of issues. Many other groups spend even less, barely scraping together enough cash to send someone to plead their case in Washington. In fact, a few groups account for a substantial fraction of total lobbying expenditures. Excuse me. That concentrate on spending is evidence in another way, as well as a large portion of lobbying is done by the business sector and relatively little by political or public interest. According to the Center for Response Politics, the top 6 sectors in 2018 to 2019 were all business interests: health, finance, miscellaneous business, communication, energy, and transportation, with 77% of the total spending on lobbying, while education, nonprofit, and public officials categorized as other and ideological single-issue political groups came in 7th and 8th, spending 7.4 and 4.4% respectively. Although the amount of money spent on lobbying by interest groups may seem like a lot and often leads to calls for restrictions on lobbying, as discussed in the Take a Stand feature, it is small compared to with how much is at stake. The federal government now spends more than $4 trillion every year, spending more than double that in 2020 because of the extraordinary response to the COVID-19 pandemic and economic recession. In recent years, spending by interest groups and by the lobbying arms of organizations and corporations has amounted to $3.5 billion every year. That's a lot of money, but it's still less than 0.1% of total federal spending. This difference raises critical question. If interest groups can control policy choices by spending money on lobbying, why aren't they spending more? We will address this question throughout the remainder of this chapter. Focus on how groups lobby and the limits of their influence over government policy. This is the end of Chapter 9, Part 1.